Greek philosophy is pretty much the foundation of Western thought, so, where did that come from? Well, we call them the Presocratics. As their namesake suggests, they were philosophers before Socrates, or Plato's Socrates, which is a bit weird, because some of them were contemporaries of Socrates. Democritus would be a bit miffed if you told him he existed before Socrates, because he was definitely very much alive at the same time. But the general idea we get is that they were the first people to do what the Greeks would call philosophy. The Presocratics weren't necessarily practicing philosophy in terms we think of. They weren't thinking about big ethical issues. As Jonathan Barn puts it in his introduction to early Greek philosophy, although some of them did talk about ethical and epistemological and other issues in their works that would be typical of philosophy, mostly they were kind of seen like physicists. Aristotle calls them physiologoi or physikoi, which means students of nature. And this physicist-student of nature dichotomy might feel a bit weird, considering some of them had some very strange ideas. Like Empedocles, who claimed to be a reincarnated god, which is a bit strange. Not exactly what you think of philosophers doing, calling themselves God and stuff. And you get a lot of that with the Presocratics. They're very, strange. But the best way to think about it is they were the first people to try and, organize and explain the cosmos, to assume it had, some sort of natural order. Like Parmenides, who talks about how everything is just one thing. He was the first monist, and his poem is very strange and difficult to get your head around. I definitely recommend reading it. It's definitely a fun read. There's a lot more that could be said about Parmenides and his work, but we'll be covering specific Presocratics in future videos and philosophers as a whole. For now, let's just get back to Presocratics in general. Geographically, they started in Ionia, more specifically in Miletus, where as tradition puts it, Thales became the first official Presocratic philosopher in between the 7th and 6th centuries. So, what did they believe, exactly? Well, you can't really classify anything that they thought into any sort of common belief, really, because there wasn't a common belief. As was stated, they just had this kind of similar way of thinking and presenting what they thought of. More extensive videos will be made on specifics, like I said. But generally, they held ideas. They wanted to talk about the first principle of the universe, for instance, such as the aforementioned Parmenides, who wanted to talk about how everything has always existed, and non-existence can't exist because you can't comprehend it. They also wanted to talk about the material principle of the universe, that is, the fundamental thing that makes everything up. Such Thales famously said that everything was made of water. Some scholars suggest Heraclitus thought that everything was made of fire. Empedocles is interesting because he said he was the first ever person to posit the idea that there were 4 fundamental elements, the classic earth, fire, water, the other one, air. And then you've got Anaxagoras, who, according to Plato, said that everything was made of nous, which I'll leave untranslated because there's no exact equivalent of what it means in the English language, but generally it just means mind or intellect or conscience. Think about it that way. Other Presocratics were more so concerned with ways of life, like Pythagoras. You've probably heard of his theorem, which he didn't actually invent. He wasn't actually much of a mathematician, maybe, or maybe he was. We have a lot of information on Pythagoras, but know very little about the actual Pythagoras. The image we get from the fragments we have from early sources suggests that he was almost in a way like this shamanic figure. He could bilocate, he could appear in 2 places at once, and he would go down into caves and project his soul outside of his body and go on celestial journeys and stuff. It's a very strange, definitely not the image of Pythagoras you learn about in school. Pythagoras would teach this theory that would spring up and become very important later, and Plato would draw on it, this theory of metempsychosis, which is essentially a very complicated, fancy way of saying reincarnation. Pythagoras famously, he walked along the street and these people were beating this dog, and he said, "Stop, I can hear that yelp, and it's the soul of my friend who's been reincarnated into this dog." Definitely a bit of a weird one. In terms of the Presocratics further, they also occasionally taught cosmologies, like Thales, who taught that the Earth was a sphere which floated on water. Anaxagoras is flat and everything is made of nous, as previously stated. However, the most interesting, I think, is Anaximenes. And I'll just read you what Hippolytus says about Anaximenes. Hippolytus says about Anaximenes, quote, "The earth is flat and rides on air, in the same way the sun and the moon and the other heavenly bodies, which are all fiery, ride the air because of their flatness. The heavenly bodies come into being from earth because mist rises from the earth and is rarefied and produces fire. And the heavenly bodies are composed of this fire when it is aloft. He says heavenly bodies move not under the earth, as others have supposed, but round the earth, as a felt cap turns round our head." Unquote. Still, on Anaximenes, Plutarch says that he thought the earth was flat like a leaf, and that the stars are fixed into the crystalline, like nails, which is pretty wacky. So it's clear that they thought some strange things, but it's the way they thought about the order of existence and thought about why nature is as it is. That's why they're important. They made this analytical way of thinking that hadn't been seen before. And a side note, Greeks saw no contradiction in some of the more scientific suggestions alongside what we might call superstitious. An ancient Greek might praise Democritus for his theory of atoms and how innovative it is, that he thinks that everything's made of small, tiny little things, and in the same breath praise Thales' astrological efforts, where he read the stars and saw that there was going to be a ripe olive harvest soon. So he bought up all the olive presses, and when he was right, because he's a philosopher, and the olive harvest came, he had a monopoly on all the olive presses, and so everyone came to him and he was able to sell it at whatever price he want, and he got rich. Also, Aristotle tells us that probably didn't happen, but you see the point, that they didn't see a contradiction between what we might differentiate between science and superstitious. It just wasn't the same in their mind view. So, anyway, to conclude, they were some pretty weird and wacky fellas, and hopefully you'll see the extent of just how weird and wacky they could get when we do further videos, some of the really strange cosmological models and just what exactly they thought we'll get into in future. But hopefully you can see their importance and how they founded this school of thought that would permeate through to today and be even important in things like our scientific method. So pretty weird, but pretty cool fellas. Peace out.